Adventure deepens friendships, overcoming these heights together. Sharing this new straight bourbon whiskey from TINCUP. Rocky Mountain water in every sip. Create memories as tall as mountains. TINCUP Bourbon, your partner in adventure.
In this video, I'm going to explain what's the difference between the new TINCUP Bourbon and the regular TINCUP whiskey, and I'm going to do the same with explaining what's the difference between regular Pendleton and the new Pendleton Bourbon. I'm going to taste through both products. I'm going to compare it to the average retail pricing in my market and tell you if I think both these products are worth it. Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. My name is Brian Donnelly. I'm an expert in distilled spirits with 9 years experience in the alcoholic beverage industry, and my aim is to educate consumers more about the alcoholic beverages they enjoy so they can make better shopping and drinking decisions. Today we are going to talk about two brand new products in my market, both from Proximo Spirits, and that's the new TINCUP Bourbon and the new Pendleton Bourbon. I know I've been covering a lot of Proximo products recently. I just did a whole series on their Cristalino portfolio with 7 different Cristalino tequilas and 1 Cristalino mezcal, but they're launching a lot of new items and they're bringing a lot of innovation to different categories, and so I feel like these products are worth discussing. So here's the new TINCUP Bourbon. TINCUP is super recognizable not just by the tin cup that covers the cap, but also it has the octagon shaped bottle, which we'll get into that here in a second. So here's the packaging on the new bourbon. White front label. Specifically says bourbon whiskey on the top. Here's your signature tin cup. Cap. Here's the back label. And then the brand has this beautiful embossing on the glass. TINCUP is a brand from Colorado, and it definitely is meant to encapsulate that kind of outdoor mountain lifestyle, and I feel like that's definitely represented in the packaging. I feel like Proximo does a really good job of advertising this brand. Especially when I'm in Colorado skiing, I see a lot of TV advertisements for TINCUP, but even when I'm back in Oklahoma, I do see a lot of TINCUP ads. TINCUP is a product that is tied to the brand Stranahan. So if you're not familiar with Stranahan's is an American single malt brand based out of Denver that is owned by Proximo Spirits. Stranahan's was the first legal distillery in the state of Colorado since Prohibition. Its distillery is located almost smack dab in the middle of downtown Denver. I highly recommend if you're in Denver, go tour Stranahan's. It's super convenient and it's a really great short tour. And, you know, the stuff they're doing with American Single Malt, I think is really cool. American Single Malt isn't necessarily a category that I actively drink or actively enjoy, but I think Stranahan's really, really helps connect the dots between single malt drinkers and bourbon drinkers by implementing some very specific production methods that really cater the American Single Malt category to the bourbon drinker. And it's important to say this because there is this link between TINCUP and Stranahan's. Now, Stranahan's is a bit more expensive. It's a bit more premium. But TINCUP, because the brand is gaining a lot of popularity, you've seen a bunch of different line extensions. So TINCUP is an American whiskey from Colorado. And then they had a 10-year-old bourbon. Then they had a 14-year-old bourbon. And then they had an American rye. And then this is meant to be kind of a counterpoint to regular TINCUP, which is an American whiskey, and we'll explain why that is here in a second, why it's not a bourbon. But this product is definitely a more entry-level price point, and I think it's meant to target that same type of consumer, but one that maybe wants an actual true bourbon. And again, I'll explain that here in a second. So because it does have such an eye-catching bottle, I have a couple notes here that I just want to explain some different talking points behind the bottle because I think it's super interesting. So people always wonder why the hexagonal shaped bottle, and the reason for that is it's so it doesn't roll down the mountain. If you're climbing 14ers or you're skiing or you're being in the outdoors and you're on a mountain or you're on an incline and you drop your bottle of bourbon or your bottle of whiskey that you're hiking or skiing with, then it won't roll in theory like a smooth bottle would obviously roll. So having those different flat sides of the hexagonal shape helps it not to roll. I thought that was super interesting. I learned that in preparing for this video. What's the deal with the TINCUP cap? Tin Cup's signature tin cup is a nod to the tin cups from which the miners used to drink. How many times can I say tin cup in this video? The cap also makes serving easy in Tin Cup's natural environments, the great outdoors. Again, this is a very lifestyle-driven brand. And then the miner's axe, so that can be seen not just here, but also embossed on the side. So, the miner's axe is used as Tin Cup symbol to pay homage to the old mining town after which the whiskey was named. Finally, what's the point of including all the embossing on the side of the bottle? So the heavily embossed sides are inspired by old whiskey bottles. Embossing was a very popular way of making a brand's logo last even after the label fell off or faded. Well, there's your 4 facts about the bottle, the shape of the bottle, the reason there's an actual cap, and I'll show you that cap screws off, as well as the background behind the embossing on the side of the bottle and the logo. The brand TINCUP has been around for many, many years, and so a lot of people don't even realize that it's not a bourbon. It says American whiskey on the bottle, and a lot of people, when they see American whiskey, they just immediately think bourbon. But obviously, American whiskey is an umbrella term. A bourbon is an American whiskey, but not all American whiskeys are bourbon. Bourbon is one of the most heavily regulated spirit categories in the world. It has a lot of rules, and we're going to get into what's the difference between TINCUP Bourbon and TINCUP American Whiskey. So, TINCUP American Whiskey is distilled from a mash bill of 2/3 corn and 1/3 rye and a small amount of barley. And that small amount of barley is just to help with the enzymatic breakdown during fermentation. So what they do is, for TINCUP American Whiskey, they're sourcing a straight bourbon whiskey from, I believe, Indiana. So probably MGP, which is now called Ross and Squibb. Let's just look on this one. Yeah, distilled in Indiana. So normally, but not always, when an American whiskey says distilled in Indiana, it is often bought on contract from MGP or Midwestern Grain Products, which is rebranded now as Ross and Squibb. And that distillery bought Luxco, which has a whole portfolio of brands, which I've talked about in other videos. TINCUP is sourcing a straight bourbon whiskey from Indiana, and then they're bringing it back to Denver to the Stranahan's distillery, where they're blending that straight bourbon whiskey with a small amount of Stranahan's American single malt whiskey. So, if you're unfamiliar with Stranahan's, I don't have the cap on the top of this one, but this is the regular Stranahan's yellow label. And again, this is not bourbon. This is an American single malt, which is a brand new, recently defined category within the United States. So when I've toured the Stranahan's distillery twice, and Rob Dietrich, the old master distiller, what he told us is when there was an uneven amount of Stranahan's left in the barrel at bottling, that would just get set aside and blended in with TINCUP. I don't know if that's still the way it is, but basically a small amount of Stranahan's is blended in with TINCUP, which is why it's no longer a bourbon, because you're now adding another whiskey to it. So it can no longer be called a bourbon. It has to be called the more generic American whiskey. And again, that's supposed to add complexity and have this nice little, Colorado tie. Well, and the final part about just TINCUP as a brand, because it's a Colorado brand, they really want to highlight their water source. So I'm just going to read something about their water. TINCUP American Whiskey is aged in number 3 charred American oak barrels for a minimum of 4 years, then cut to proof with Rocky Mountain water and bottled at an elevation of 5,251 feet. Okay, yeah, it's bottled at the Stranahan's Distillery in Denver. And then with it being cut to proof with Rocky Mountain water, TINCUP is also blended with a small amount of Colorado single malt whiskey. Okay, so I already touched on that. And finally, regular TINCUP is bottled at 84 proof or 42% ABV. What does that mean for our new product, TINCUP Bourbon? We talked about TINCUP American Whiskey from Colorado. This is TINCUP Bourbon. One of the reasons I want to have this video is to explain the difference between TINCUP Bourbon and TINCUP American Whiskey, and then taste through this particular product, compare it with pricing, and tell you if I think it's worth it. So, TINCUP Bourbon is going to be that same mash bill, 2/3 corn, 1/3 rye, small amount of malted barley for fermentation purposes. It's going to be aged a minimum of 4 years in a number 3 charred new American oak barrel. And of course, it's going to be cut with that same Rocky Mountain water because this is a Colorado brand. It's a lifestyle brand. Having that Colorado tie is super, super important. And obviously, with all the mountains and peaks in the state of Colorado and all the elevation, it's going to be a great source of really high quality water. And then unlike TINCUP whiskey, which is bottled at 84 proof or 42% ABV, this product is bottled at 80 proof or 40% ABV, which leads me to believe, both by looking at the price point, which we'll talk about pricing here in a second, as well as the proof, that they want this to be a very entry-level bourbon. You know, they want this to be a bourbon that a wide variety of customers might buy, and that customers, you know, might actually make cocktails with and mix drinks with and mix. So this is a product that is meant for mixing, both by the price point and usually the proof. That's a good indication that, you know, this is kind of an all-purpose entry-level cocktail bourbon. All right, enough talking about it. Let's taste it. So, got a brand new bottle here. So the cap unscrews. Here's your cork top. And then this just screws down. So unscrew. And with this tin cup, you obviously have a super convenient way of drinking your whiskey when you're out in the great outdoors. Unlike Stranahan's. So the Stranahan's caps just sit on the top and they don't screw down. So a lot of people grab it and they drop the bottle and they break the bottle. I've seen it many, many times. This actually does screw down, which is super convenient because like it won't fall off. So I got a brand new bottle here. All right. All right, the color is just described as amber, so pretty generic. The aroma is described as vanilla cream, worn leather, pipe tobacco, and caramel. I would say it's a pretty subtle, kind of generic bourbon nose. Nothing really stands out. Now, when I taste it, previously I would just take one taste, swish it around, spit it out, and just kind of talk you through what I'm tasting and compare it to the tasting notes I received from the supplier. Obviously, when you taste things multiple times, the flavors change on your palate. Your palate becomes accustomed to the alcohol, accustomed to the different flavors. You can taste more things. So I'm going to try to taste each of these spirits twice and see if anything changes on the palate. So the palate for this is described as butterscotch, dried orange, allspice, clove, tarragon, and peach. So interesting, complex tasting notes. Let's see if it holds up. It's definitely got a little sharpness from the alcohol, but that goes away pretty quick. Dried orange, allspice, clove, kind of stereotypical baking spice flavors. Definitely get that. Not sure if I'm getting that kind of herbal tarragon or even that peach, that stone fruit. Not sure if I'm quite getting that, but let's taste it a second time. Definitely not as boozy the second time. I mean, this thing's only 80 proof. Butterscotch, dried orange, baking spices. I don't know if I'm getting the herbal or the stone fruit, but I would say, I mean, very classic bourbon flavors. Butterscotch, baking spices, dried fruit. This is pleasant. This is very nice. It's a bit simple, but we'll get into pricing here in a second. But I think for this, it's very representative of this price point. I think this definitely delivers good classic bourbon flavor for the price. Nothing earth shattering, but nothing offensive. And the finish is described as rye spice with a sweet, smooth finish. I would say it's a very enjoyable, smooth finish. It doesn't hang around for too long. But I like high rye bourbon, and TINCUP is a high rye bourbon. I feel like the rye gives it some good flavor, but nothing overpowering. I would say anybody that has any interest in whiskey or particularly bourbon, would enjoy this. So do I think it's worth it? Well, let's look at the pricing. So keep in mind, I'm based here in Tulsa, Oklahoma, so I'm going to be quoting average retail price here in my market, but every single market's different, so check your local liquor store for pricing. So TINCUP Bourbon, my market's going to retail somewhere between, let's call it $19 and $21. So $20, do I think this bourbon's worth $20? I do. I do think it's worth $20. I think the packaging's really cool. You know, I love to ski, I love to hike, so I'm a sucker for these kind of lifestyle-driven, outdoorsy brands. So I'm a huge fan of TINCUP and Stranahan's because it kind of captures that very romanticized vision of being in the outdoors. You know, what is the time in the great outdoors without a little bit of good whiskey? So $20, I think this is a great deal. I think it offers, you know, a cool product, nice packaging, and really classic bourbon flavor. I think you can enjoy this in any way, whether it's by itself, neat on the rocks, or in a mixed drink or cocktail, and it would do very, very well. So, you know, I think the biggest thing holding this particular product back is customers are not going to understand what's the difference between TINCUP Bourbon and TINCUP American Whiskey, which you now know from watching this video. You know the difference. But yeah, I think this product's worth it. And I think if you are looking for a product in this particular price point, this would be a great option. And if you want a product that kind of fits into that lifestyle, skiing, hiking, outdoorsy vibe, I think this obviously fits very nicely in there. I love the ability to screw down the tin cup on the cap and be able to have a way to drink whiskey no matter where I go. I think that's really cool. And again, you might think it's a little gimmicky, but I think it's cool. So thank you so much for watching. Please give this video a like and consider subscribing. If you'd like to be notified when I have new content on my website or this YouTube channel, please consider subscribing to my email newsletter. I'll leave a link below in the description. And if you would like to support this channel further, please consider becoming a Patreon member or gift me a cocktail to the link below in the description. And as always, please drink responsibly. Cheers.